Good day. My name is Yu Tao. I'm an associate professor in the Asian Studies discipline here at the University of Western Australia. And I currently serve as publications officer and a member of the executive board of the Asian Studies Association of Australia, or ASAA for short. So as a part of the ASAA's 50th years anniversary celebrations, we are recording a series of oral history interviews with colleagues who have contributed to the validity and diversity of Asian studies in Australia. These conversations are a chance to reflect not only on our collective history, but also on the evolving direction of our field. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Minerva Inwald, a historian of modern China, whose work sits at the intersection of culture, social, and arts history. And beyond academia, she has also curated many important exhibitions of Chinese contemporary arts. So, Minerva, thank you so much for being a part of this project, and it's really a pleasure to have you with us. Can I begin by asking you about your origin story in Asian studies? When, where, and how did this all happen?
No, thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be invited to contribute to this series. As for my own origin in Asian studies, it goes all the way back to my childhood in Australia, in Sydney, in the 1990s. So when I was about 7 years old, my mother made the executive decision that I was going to learn another language. And the language that she ended up settling on was Chinese. So why learning another language? Well, both my parents basically kind of grew up overseas and are bilingual or trilingual themselves. However, the only language they shared was English. So grew up in a mostly English language speaking home. But my mother in particular was very keen to make sure that I did study another language from childhood. I think she was a bit found the Australian university, the Australian primary school system a bit disgraceful that it only had, 1 hour a week of language study. Um, and so then I guess the question is why Chinese?
Chinese, yes.
Yeah. So my mother had kind of grown up a bit in Asia herself. So my grandfather worked for the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And so she grew up between mostly between Bangkok and Rome, but also lived in Papua New Guinea, and also in Darwin amongst the sort of Chinese Australian community there as well. So she'd been to Hong Kong in the 1960s with my grandparents' Chinese Australian friends. So, yeah, I think my mother actually wished that she had learned an Asian language. She did a bit of Indonesian at Sydney University in the 70s, but she really wanted to learn Thai, and she actually wrote her honors thesis on Thai history. At the time in Sydney in the 1990s, obviously there was a big Chinese diaspora already, but I happened to grow up in Newtown, which is next to the University of Sydney. And one of the women who, Nancy, who looked after my brother in daycare, she was someone who had teaching experience. She'd been a student at Sydney University, and she suggested to my mother that she should take me to Sydney Chinese School, that time on Cleveland Street in Sydney. And so, yeah, Nancy was a teacher there. And yeah, my mom just decided then that that was what we were going to do. And so for the first 3 weeks, she sat with me in the class. And then for the next 3 months, she would sit in the playground until I kind of accepted this was my fate and had made friends and things like that.
Well, that's fascinating. And can you ask a little bit more about the like the cultural landscape regarding learning Chinese as a second language in the 1990s? Were you the only or the very few kids who were not like looks Asia? Were you the one of the few Caucasian kids there?
Yeah, so I was the only white kid there, I guess I would say. There was a huge diversity in terms of the Chinese Australian community. So, first of all, the school taught both Mandarin and Cantonese, as was maybe to be expected at the time. But also, I remember that my friends, none of them spoke Mandarin at home. Some would have spoken Cantonese at home and were going to learn Mandarin, but then also a lot of like Indonesian Chinese, or other Southeast Asian Chinese people who maybe actually didn't speak much Chinese at home, but their parents felt that it was important for them to learn. So yeah, I was the one. So I was a bit of an object of fascination, I guess, especially when my mom would hang out at the school, the Chinese parents would come up and say like, "Well, why are you here?" In a positive kind of way. And she would sort of say like, "Well, I think China's going to be big," and they liked that answer. Uh, and yeah, I would say that actually I never felt like obviously I knew that I was learning in a different way, or had a different kind of experience to everyone else there, but I was so warmly welcomed by the Chinese Australian community. And I think I always feel that I owe a debt to even my, people like Nancy, the teacher who kind of guided me through, but also just to the other students in class who became my friends and made me feel like it was totally normal and for, to be doing something that was a bit unexpected in terms of second language acquisition.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So during your years that from that Chinese school, and all the way to you then decided eventually probably be a professional researcher in Chinese studies. So during all this period, was there a particular book, film, or encounter or event that helped you to really making your mind to actually not only learn the language but become a professional in Asian studies field?
Yeah, yeah. So basically, I continued in Chinese studies. I continued doing Chinese in primary school and through high school as well. But I didn't really know what I was going to do with my Chinese language skills. I was always really interested in the classroom discussions. I guess that's where I first learned about Chinese history, was listening to my classmates talk about their grandparents' experiences in China, say during the Cultural Revolution, or talking about the Japanese invasion of China as well.
So is
So
that in the secondary school or in the
in
university?
high school,
In
yeah.
high
So that
school,
was
right?
actually, I found all that really fascinating, but I didn't know what to make of it. And then when I started at university, I enrolled in a course called BA Languages. And that was, I think, the first time I mean, I'd always studied Chinese, but it was kind of like just an inevitable thing that I didn't really think about. And I don't think my mum really had a plan for what to do with it either. So it was then in university, I thought, okay, I'm seriously learning Chinese. I'm going to continue. But I never knew what aspect, I didn't know anything about China, unlike other people say at my high school studying French, who'd been to France on exchange in high school. I had never been to China. I didn't really know anything. Um, so really important, I was very interested always in kind of 20th century visual art, kind of avant-gardism in Europe and particularly in Europe, I guess, and America a bit too. Uh, and then in my first year at university, in my art history course, I had a guest lecture from Dr. Thomas Bergus on Chinese avant-garde art in the 1980s, which just totally blew my mind. And that was the moment that I understood what I could really do with my language skills, that there wasn't just kind of avant-gardism in Europe and the Western world, that China had its own history of avant-gardism. And then I remember the kind of slide that came up. There was a group in China in the 1980s called the Xiamen Dada group, and I could read like Dada in Chinese, and so that's when I could really see what I could do with my language skills. So it was then under the good advice of Wang Yiyan, who was then in Chinese studies at the University of Sydney, who suggested that I do honors, but I do a joint honors
Mm.
between Chinese studies and art history. So that's when I first sort of, I originally, yeah, as at the time decided I, wanted to work on avant-gardism in the 1980s. When I wrote my honors thesis, I got trapped in the 1960s. It turns out I found, that earlier period of socialist China much more interesting. And that's how I then sort of from there progressed, switched to the history department at the University of Sydney, which was where I did my PhD with Helen Dunstan.
So did you go to your PhD immediately after the honors, or did you work in between?
I took a year off. I think at the end of honors, they say is like a sprint, as opposed to the marathon of the PhD. I took a year off and I went and what my friend got me a job at this IT company. So they did IT for barristers, and I was hired to just answer a phone. I had to pretend I was in barristers' chambers and do this the switchboard. Uh,
So with your Asian studies background, how that help for that job in those days?
That's probably the one job in my life where my Chinese language skills didn't help. But every other job I've been hired for has been because of my Chinese, from like working at the newsagent in university up until now. But actually, the accountant there, she was Chinese. And so it always, I think, helps to create a kind of affinity with other colleagues. And then she ended up leaving, and I ended up becoming the accountant myself. So but yeah, that's probably the one job I didn't have. But it did remind me, I think, then of how important it was for me to continue to do work with China. So after about 9 months, I quit and I just went to Beijing for 2 months to hang out and think about preparing my PhD application. So it led me towards that, both in terms of allowing me to save the money to do that, but also making me realize, no, I do want to continue doing work that relates to China.
So that's fascinating. So let's fast forward to now. I mean, how do you describe your expertise in Asian studies now? Like, what are you focusing on, and what research you are doing? How do you see yourself's professional identity?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest kind of struggles for me as an academic has not been the Asian studies side of it. Everyone in Asian studies also is very warm and welcoming, and the in Chinese studies in particular. But the disciplinary aspect of it has been more challenging for me. As I said, I went from art history honors into a history PhD
Mm.
program. And my PhD supervisor, Helen Dunstan, always encouraged me to make use of my art history training, but I wasn't really exactly sure how, really until actually I finished the PhD. So, the way I describe my expertise now is that I'm a historian of modern China, but that my research uses the visual arts and material culture to explore Chinese history. So, for example, my current book project is looking at the relationship between the visual arts and socialist class politics in the Mao era. So, if you're a peasant, how should you paint? What should your paintings look like in order to reinforce those kind of Marxian class categories that were so important in Chinese society in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s? Um, but I'm also, very interested in material culture as well, again, from my art history training. So, thinking about when in my teaching, for example, I do a lot of teaching with historical objects. So, bringing in like old scrapbooks from the Mao era and getting students to think about how they were put together, or, even old curtains, things like that, and what that teaches us about the way in which people lived in the past at the kind of level of everyday experience rather than high politics.
That's fascinating. Can you tell us a little bit more about this book project that's ongoing? Like, what kind of materials that you use, and how do you normally find them?
Yeah, so I went to do my field work in Beijing in 2015, 2016. I already knew before I started my PhD that access to the archive I really wanted of the Chinese Artists Association, that was not going to happen. And whether there is or is not an archive, actually, no one's been really able to tell me. So I had to sort of get a bit creative in what I did. So I went to the Central Academy of Fine Arts, where I was an exchange student during my PhD, and I just photographed about 100 art books from the Mao era, and that gave me a real understanding of the kind of changing visuality throughout the period. But then the other tactic that I use most commonly now is I actually buy material from kongfuzi.com, which is like a Chinese secondhand eBay for historical books and materials. So you can find, things like exhibition catalogs, but also internal newsletters of the Artists Association. I mean, things like I have sitting on my desk, from the late 1970s, early 1980s, like translations of foreign language art material into Chinese. So yeah, kind of ephemera objects. So for teaching, I bought things like, as I said, curtains that I use for teaching with students. I just bought a pencil
Maybe some
case online.
posters. Yeah.
Posters, yeah, I first bought posters when I was actually an undergraduate student on exchange in China. We went out to this market, my friend and I. So I had some posters from then that, yeah, I used to teach with. So posters are great because, getting students to think about why they need to be light and why they're that kind of size tells us about how they're meant to be used as well. So yeah, the University of Melbourne has a fantastic collection. So in the past, I'd kind of worked with my own collection in teaching. Uh, but now, yeah, I don't have to buy as much stuff because we have an amazing collection of historical materials from China at the University of
So
Melbourne.
are those collections open to public, or mainly that's for teaching purpose in of Melbourne?
So they're open to external researchers. So you can book, you just kind of put in a request for the rare materials. So that's how I was originally engaging with them and why I think they're such a fantastic and important collection. We obviously have great museum collections in Australia of objects from Chinese history, but it can be quite hard to get access to materials in museums. So yeah, you just put in a request, you get to sit in the nice reading room and they'll bring you the objects, yeah, even as an external researcher.
That's
So yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I think both your introduction about the collections in Uni Melbourne, but also your description of how you use the Kongfuzi, Chinese second book eBay to get materials. And I think that really remind us that there are so many ways to do research on Asian or on China. Of course, going there is always exciting, but I mean, you don't have to. There are many other ways to do this research. That's fascinating. Let's just turn the focus a little bit to a slightly different direction. Let's now talk about ASAA. How do you find ASAA, and when you first joined ASAA, and why did you choose to join ASAA? Can you still remember those details?
So when I first joined ASAA, it was when I was a PhD student. So the art history department at the University of Sydney, or Power Institute, maybe had pulled together some money to run two panels on Chinese art history. And so our panels were accepted. That was, yeah, I think ASA was probably my first experience with a really big conference. It was at the University of Sydney, so that was easy, but yeah, it was incredible, just, multiple panels running at the same time. So that was my very first experience. I guess I always knew about ASAA, but when you're a PhD student, you're not always necessarily staying a current member because you're trying to conserve your funds. Then later on, when I was kind of, but after I finished my PhD and before I started my postdoc, I got involved with the Australian Society for Asian Humanities, Josh Stenberg, and others, Megan Morris, Christian Cornell, brought me on board to kind of be their seminars officer. And through working with them, I ended up getting to know Professor Louise Edwards, who then, when ASAA was looking for someone to kind of quickly step in as secretary in 2021, Louise put my name forward. And yeah, having been to the conference and understanding from working with the Australian Society for Asian Humanities the kind of importance of these organizations, ASAA was like the big one. So I was really excited to get the opportunity to kind of sit on the executive and learn from more senior colleagues about, how advocacy works in Asian studies and how this organization ran and runs.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit more about that? Like, during how many years did you work as the secretary, and during those years, what was your observation of the organization, both in terms of its internal kind of running, but also like its roles, in Asian studies in Australia? Yeah.
Yes, I was secretary for 3 years from 2021, I think, yes, till 2024. Uh, what I would say, yeah, so when I first started, Kate McGregor was the president, and Melissa Crouch was VP. David Hunt was on the executive as well. Liz Kramer was treasurer. Anyway, it was a really dynamic group of individuals who were extremely professional. I think that was the first thing that really struck me. And that sounds really boring, but I actually think that's really important to kind of have good processes, in place to make sure that the organization can actually function smoothly. I felt that we would have these meetings and decisions would actually be made and things happen, kind of quite different to maybe like department meetings in universities and things like that. Yeah, the sense that this was a kind of dynamic organization that was actually doing things. So, quite quickly I had to kind of get on top of running the early career researcher book prize. And Kate McGregor kind of helped me through that. But that, the importance of that was really great because it was, you see how the organization then actually contributes back towards fueling the careers of researchers at all different levels. But perhaps, all those things were really, are important to the ecology. But I would say the thing that kind of really struck me most was the advocacy. So seeing and kind of contributing to the consultation around and watching the process of creating the ASAA report on Asia education in Australia that Melissa Crouch and Ed Aspinall did. That was something that I really admired because it addressed not just our kind of scholarly community, but was designed to address government as well, and is a tool that people outside of Asian studies can actually use to advocate, and the community in Asian studies can use to advocate not only within our own universities, but also to government as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and um, I'm really how to say I can really resonate that when you say that ASAA, although I mean it is a professional association, but everyone work as volunteers really, apart from very few editors perhaps. But it's very professional, and that's very different. We are all members of different associations, and very few associations run in such a smooth way like the ASAA, at least in the period that both of us are
Yeah.
involved in the running of it, I suppose. So if you think about now, you did mention about advocacy, but including and beyond that, how do you assess the position of, you know, both ASAA, but also Asian studies as a field in Australia? And I suppose also through your experience or observation, how has that changed over time in the last few decades, maybe from the 1990s all the way to now? Yeah.
I mean, my observations are sort of anecdotal because I've only, really been kind of working professionally in the field for, sort of 5 years or so. But what I would say is that my entire childhood, and, into university, when I told people that I was learning Chinese, they would say, "Wow, you're going to get a job at the end of that. Like, that's so good for your career." And I don't know whether I've just kind of aged out of that phase of my life where people make those kind of condescending remarks to you. But I don't hear that as much now. And I don't think that if I was learning Chinese now, that I would be have that same sense in the wider community of the value of learning Asian languages to your professional career beyond the university, whether that be in kind of corporate or in the government sector. And I worry about that because, I think that I do think that, as I said throughout my life, any sort of minor connection to even working at the news agency where they hired me because, granddad worked on Sunday and he didn't speak English, even just a minor level of Chinese was, really useful. So I do think that, that's the kind of utilitarian, not to say all the sort of fantastic other things that come with being able to learn a language and have that kind of cross-cultural communication. So yeah, my sense is that there has been a gradual decline. Australia was always bad in recognizing the value of other languages, but it seems that there was maybe a point where people did kind of feel there was a kind of sense in the wider community that it was important, that maybe is tapering off a little bit now. And I think that's why, as I said, the ASAA report that actually takes that kind of anecdotal evidence and puts it into a document that actually shows us like what that change over time in language learning looks like, and that there has been a decline, and points to what actually, for me, things that I didn't realize, like in the 1990s, the kind of government support for, learning languages, that those kinds of things were probably what was fueling those conversations around me as a child about like, oh, it's so important to learn an Asian language. So yeah, I think ASAA has a really important role to play in kind of reminding um, people in the Asian studies community and the broader community that there was a time where Asian languages and Asian studies was really, really valued. And how do we kind of build back up to that kind of moment that we had then?
So if you reflect on that, why do you think, the momentum seems to decline a little bit? What's the
Yeah,
reason behind that?
yeah.
Is it
I
more really the government policy, or is it the societal change, or is it the culture trends? It's probably a combination of a few factors, but
yeah.
um, when you reflect on your own experience and your observation, your engagement with the wider community, and when did that happen, firstly, and why do you think these things happen in our field?
Look, I think there's obviously there was less government interest, I think, and the report kind of outlines all that. But I also there was, of course, I think during COVID, the deterioration of Australia-China relations, I think, had a huge impact. So there were jobs that I was interviewing for in 2019 where my Chinese, like, where yes, we're going to have a whole Chinese language aspect to this, blah, blah, blah. In cultural institutions, like outside university sector, we're going to have Chinese language materials. And then that never really eventuated. And I think that was the kind of scaremongering around Chinese investment in Australia really that certainly in terms of Chinese studies, at least, put a dampener on the ability to kind of the sort of celebration of China is actually an important area of collaboration, efforts to kind of work with the Chinese community, Chinese Australian community. I feel like all of that suddenly became very touchy. And with the kind of broader degradation of the sort of Australia, with the kind of cuts in Australian universities through COVID too, I think everybody's building back up. But I do think Chinese studies struggled perhaps in particular. Also, I think across Asian languages, one of the biggest selling points we have in language studies are international exchanges. And so if you think about the last few years where we haven't been able to send students overseas, um, that is, of course, going to make it less attractive to university students or even high school students to study another language.
Yeah, that's interesting. And also, I want to ask you a probably a little bit academically controversial question, because we all feel that there's decline in Asian language educations there, and it's both recorded in the reports, but also we observe things unfold vividly still. I mean, in front of us, like universities cutting their language providings, especially in English, not English, sorry, Asian language providings. But then, on the same time, there are actually quite lots of, for example, security studies, and then IR researches, and many of these are about Indo-Pacific or, about, for example, Taiwan Strait, about China. So what's your view or opinion on the link between language and area studies? If people want to study China, do they have to know Chinese?
Yeah, look, maybe I'm just because I have invested, 25 years of my life in this, of course I'm going to say yes. But I actually, one of the things I would say that language studies could get onto more is that the people in IR won't like this. But for me, actually learning Chinese, I would say is a bit of a decolonizing practice of myself. That in Chinese, I am like, sorry, that's my email. In Chinese, I am, a child who wanders around Beijing as I, just was like everyone kind of, I can't express myself. I talk a lot in English. In Chinese, I have to just sit down and listen. It was also the only classroom where I had consistently teachers who were people of color as well. So I actually think that there's a huge value in it that from that perspective. Um, Furthermore, on the language skills themselves too, okay, like we can use translators now, etc. But actually, for learning Chinese, if you want to understand IR security, it's the subtleties in Chinese propaganda that are the things that you need to keep an eye out for. And so I actually think that you're going to miss a lot in the study of China from those kind of more political perspectives if you can't sort of read what's put out by the Chinese government in ways that actually recognizes the kind of subtlety of Chinese language. The translation, it's just frankly like reading a translation, it's not going to make much sense in English, right? And that's why I would always encourage, even students, I have honor students who maybe don't have the most advanced Chinese language skills to have a go at reading in Chinese and see what they can do as just a way of also like trying to challenge themselves, first of all, to see the world from a different perspective other than the kind of Anglophone world. But also because, yeah, I do think it's a really valuable skill to learn if, people do go and work in government as well, to actually be able to understand how things are phrased in Chinese too. I think this is where humanities, we need to sort of claw back, I think. We certainly in history across Australia, I think there's a strong sense that we are losing students to political science. And this is, I think, where we need to sort of sell ourselves more in terms of, yeah, we offer a different way of understanding China that perhaps isn't just this kind of security or IR type
Yeah,
response.
and I agree with you, and I think even for security studies and knowing the language will only help, because we know from not even contemporary. For example, my old teacher in Oxford, Henrietta Harrison, write this beautiful book about the interpreters during the Lord Macartney's mission to the Qing Empire. So that, I mean, the interpreters we can see even during those days played a fundamentally important role. I mean, how did they choose to translate certain phrases would have direct impact to what kind of action both parties would take, and that would have shaped the whole history. And I can only imagine those things, even with the AI, with other things, will still be so important in contemporary
That's
diplomacy. Yeah.
that's right. And I think students, they don't often see the labor of translation, and we don't reward that perhaps in the academic sector enough either. But yes, I too was just reading the memoirs of a translator from the Soviet Union, of the Soviet ambassador in China in the 1950s. And as soon as they translated this term like People's Commune during the Great Leap Forward, the Russian ambassador freaked out and he's like, is that really what it says? So the moment of translation is actually really crucial to, yeah, in this case, the unfolding of the whole Sino-Soviet relationship. So yeah, I think also, I know people who work for DFAT in the Australian government. They send you for 2 years of language training before they'll send you to China or anywhere because they recognize the value for diplomacy. That if you can, I remember someone, I think they worked at someone maybe who'd perhaps been in Japan, that if you could quote to the Japanese ambassador, who was, the counterpart, if you could quote a piece of Japanese poetry, that would certainly set a different tone in the meeting as well. So, yeah, I think we do a disservice to our students in a sense by not telling them from the outset of their undergraduate degrees that this might actually be something really valuable to them in the professional space.
That's fascinating. And in concluding our conversation, I just want you to, if you might, nominate a few things, maybe up to three, that we as professionals work in Asian studies field, either collectively or individually, can do to better prepare ourselves and our field, our professional for the future.
Yeah, so one thing I would say is, first of all, uh, we we need to, I think, in academia in general and in the humanities, talk, but perhaps particularly in Asian studies, talk more to people outside the universities about their journeys, perhaps with Asian studies, and use that as a way to kind of educate our students, educate ourselves about what kinds of skills in Asian studies what our value is, right? It's very easy to say like, oh, like I love studying China. But that's my job, that's my passion. You know, how do we actually talk about this in really practical ways about its usefulness? Instead of, as you say, like we could just sit there and lament the decline of Asian languages, but we also need to come up with a good reason for why students need to keep learning these languages and why the university should keep investing in it. Secondly, I would say, uh, you know, again, that kind of relates to advocacy. So, in my experience, working, because I work primarily in the disciplines, so history or, you know, I was at the School of Art and Design at UNSW. It's very rare that you have someone who is a chair of discipline or department or a head of school who has any Asia experience in, say, you know, schools of history and philosophy. So we need to, as academics, first of all, senior people like yourself need to kind of step into those roles. But also we also, you know, we do have to do a job, I think, of educating our colleagues who don't study Asia about the specificities, the difficulties of research, and, you know, what we bring to the table, because I feel like we can sometimes retreat into the more friendly and supportive world of Asian studies itself, but we need to kind of use that community to then advocate to the disciplines as well, I think, to get a stronger voice in decision making around, say, curriculum in disciplines like you know, even political science or history. Yeah, so those would be um, my, you know, I guess finally, I guess collaborating with each other too. So, you know, I projects like your, you know, Chinese history in Western Australia project that again, you're kind of, I think is such a fantastic example of taking a sort of Asian studies lens, but then working with people in different disciplines who don't actually work on Asia, but finding those commonalities to build really innovative projects is also a way to make sure that Asian studies remains on the agenda more broadly, you know, outside our little sphere. Our little sphere is really important and is where we can kind of work together to build capacity that we can then push out, I think, more broadly through the university sector and to government and things like that as well.
Oh, thank you so much, Minerva, for sharing all these insights and for being with us in this exciting project. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.